So welcome everyone to this talk on finding meaning when you have ME/CFS. I am myself an ME/CFS patient. I've been ill for around 6 years. The first thing to say is that when you have ME/CFS, this is not an illness that anyone would choose to have. Oftentimes, when you develop this, it actually does shatter a lot of the previous meaning that you had in your life. It can shatter the hopes, it can shatter the aspirations you might have had. Not all of them, some of those things may well continue, perhaps in modified forms. But a lot of your previous life, you had certain things you wanted to do, certain things you wanted to achieve, and suddenly those things may not be available to you anymore. And so suddenly you're faced with a challenge. And that challenge is actually to rebuild your sense of meaning, your sense of purpose, the kinds of hopes you might have. When you have an illness like ME/CFS, it's not an easy task actually to develop a sense of meaning. And this is for several reasons. The first is that sometimes the quality of life can actually be very low. It can be low all the time, or it can be low intermittently. And when you are in a situation like that, greater questions of meaning and purpose can sometimes seem irrelevant, because actually you're just trying to survive. You're just trying to get through to the next hour. And at those times, that effort is actually meaning enough. But there's another reason why finding meaning can be harder when you have ME/CFS. And that is that just physically, you can be doing very poorly. Your physiological affect can be quite poor. And what I mean by this is that, we are physical beings. Our brain is a physical organ. And if our body is struggling, if it's not working so well, and the brain isn't working so well, our mental health can suffer. The lens through which we see life can become more negative. And that's not through any fault of your own. And this kind of thing, speaking personally and from experience of talking to other ME patients, can be quite upsetting. It's not a moral failing. It's not your fault. But there are ways in which the illness can actually change people's personalities. There are examples of this from other health problems. So people who, for example, have a brain tumor and their personality starts to change, they start to become irritable, they may become eccentric or whatever. And it's not a moral failing, it's because of a physical change that's actually taken place. And the problem with ME/CFS is you have less blood reaching the brain, less blood perfusing into the brain, and so personality can actually change. And as I say, this can be upsetting for people. They may become more withdrawn. They may have more difficulty feeling emotions. They may feel a bit flatter. Social situations might be harder, and so on. And it's important to have compassion with yourself if this is something you struggle with. But it is something that also can make it harder to find that sense of meaning, to find that sense of purpose, because the lens through which you see life can become, through no fault of your own, a bit more negative. Nevertheless, it is possible to develop certain perspectives. These perspectives mightn't change the illness, but they can give you strength. When you're feeling down, when you're feeling like things are very hard, you can bring to mind these perspectives, and they can give you something to hold on to help you get through those moments and to help you get through that time. And so in today's talk, I'm sharing with you some of the perspectives that I have developed, which have helped me with my own chronic illness. And I'd be lying to say I haven't had times which have been dark. I have. I'm sure many of you have as well. But I found these perspectives helpful, and there may be something in these which you might find useful to incorporate. But ultimately, before we get going on those perspectives, it's important to say that the sense of meaning that everyone finds is highly individual. It's highly personal, it's highly subjective. And this is the nature of finding meaning. It is a personal quest. Everyone has different life circumstances. Everyone has a different history. Everyone has different relationships, a different health status, different quality of life, different interests, and different talents. And the intersection of all of those things and where you are overall situated in the human story in general, in life as it's playing out right now on a bigger level, is how people find meaning. So I want to just share with you an important question to ask yourself. Some of you may have heard of Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, and he was someone with a psychotherapeutic background. And all of his family died in the Holocaust. So he went in, he had a wife, he had parents, etc., family, they all died. And at the end, he was the only one who was still alive. And so he had this catastrophic event, a lot of suffering, and the rug was pulled out from underneath him, and he had to start again. He had to find meaning again somehow. And what he did is he developed something called logotherapy. Now, logotherapy literally means meaning therapy. And the whole idea is, how can we individually construct our personal sense of meaning? It'll be different for me as it is for Sarah, as it is for Sandra. And so the question that Viktor Frankl would pose his clients was, given your life circumstances, your history, your relationships, your particular talents, your particular interests, what is life asking you to do? Right? What is life asking you to do? And this question is the basis for his most famous exploration of finding meaning, which I thoroughly recommend you to read. It's a very short book, a very powerful book. There on the screen, Man's Search for Meaning. So 3 areas that I'm going to be sharing with you today, which are my answers to this question as a chronically ill person, will relate to finding meaning in ME/CFS itself, the actual illness, the big picture of the situation. Secondly, finding meaning within the experience of suffering itself. And thirdly, finding meaning in trying to reduce suffering. So first of all, the meaning of ME/CFS itself. Now, when we reflect on ME/CFS at a big picture level, we have a situation where there are millions of ME/CFS patients worldwide. Estimates are that 1/4 of them are severe, housebound or bedridden. Most receive no effective treatment. There's no real urgency to change the situation. Not an insubstantial number of people suffer from being told that their problem is psychological. And occasionally some people are even sectioned. So this is a pretty bad situation. And it could seem meaningless because it's not great. But I actually think that it can be flipped around and seen as meaningful. And so why do I say that? Well, because what we see in relation to ME/CFS is actually the perennial human story. In every age, in every society, there are societal blind spots. There are certain people who are always ostracized or marginalized, or in some sense, whose suffering is invisible to society in general. It might not be that society in general wants it to be that way, but in general, it's tolerated, that particular situation. There are some big examples of this phenomenon. For example, lepers, the untouchables, the institution of slavery, the burning of so-called witches, or people being happy with, for example, many gay people dying from AIDS. These are societal blind spots. And what happens with these situations is that at some point there come along some people who actually say, this isn't okay. This isn't all right. We need to fight to change this. And those people start to do that. And initially, there's usually intense opposition. But if that fight has truth on its side, usually, but not always, that quest usually wins and things change. And that societal blind spot actually no longer is a blind spot. And society starts to care in the way that it should about that previous group of people. And what also we see with this pattern, it's what I call the ship turning around slowly. So whenever something needs to change like this, there's a ship that needs to change direction, but it always happens slowly. And it can be torturous to watch. It can be, people who see where it needs to go, they can see the direction the ship needs to go in, but the process actually happens slowly. And so the ME/CFS story is actually part of this same pattern. We have a societal blind spot. We have millions of people around the world who are not getting the help they need. This is a medical injustice. It's a lack of medical equality. We have a situation where, because people don't understand how serious the illness can be, there are comedians who get up on stage and make jokes about ME/CFS patients, and the audience can laugh. We have journalists writing articles that are highly insensitive about ME patients. This is a situation that's not right. And it's actually part of a, it's like a sub-genre. There's societal blind spots and there's medical blind spots. And the pattern in relation to ME/CFS has previously happened with other illnesses, such as multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's, which were once viewed as psychological issues before the actual problems were identified. It's just ironic that a lot of those in the medical profession who still push the psychologization narrative of ME/CFS, they don't see where they're situated in the overall narrative, of the overall history of neglect or psychologization of illnesses. But what we're seeing now, as I say, is the same pattern. We have the injustice, and now we have people who have been fighting for ME/CFS patients. So here are a few of them, but there's many researchers who are doing this. Here's Klaus Wirth, Ron Davis, Carmen Scheibenbogen. They're all fighting to unravel the illness, to develop treatments. And the world doesn't reward these people particularly. They could get much more rewards and prestige from other areas. The system is not set up to reward these people, but they are choosing to take the harder course. And so what we're seeing in real time at the moment is the ship is actually turning around. Yes, it's slow. Yes, it's tortured, but it is happening. There's more mention of ME/CFS in the media. There's more research. The situation with long COVID has obviously added a lot more awareness to the situation, although sometimes people don't understand that it is essentially the same, but it has added a lot more to awareness and research. And so we're seeing it happening. And so these people are stepping up to the plate and they are playing their part in turning the situation around. Now, it's also, however, something that we as ME/CFS patients, as difficult as our lives can be, and as limited as they can be, And sometimes we feel that we're powerless, but actually we're not. And so it's something that we too can play a role in, which is in turning around the ME/CFS ship. Because even though millions of people, as they say in relation to ME/CFS, millions missing, there are millions of people missing from playing a more active role in society, but our voices are not missing. And there is a power in the collective voices, you could say, almost from the shadows. And so something that's given my life meaning is to ask myself, yes, within the limitations of what I can do, and within the limitations of self-care, how can I help this situation? What can I do to play my part in helping things turn around? And a lot of ME/CFS patients do this, and it doesn't have to be big things. It can be talking, choosing to talk in a more empowered way to friends and family about what happens in the illness. Or it could be helping out with some fundraising or some volunteering or publishing a YouTube video with your story or writing a little article for a local paper, whatever it might be. But lots of ME patients do this, and their voice does matter, and it does change things. Here's an example. This is an ME/CFS patient called Anil van der Sea, who's from the Netherlands. And he has a YouTube channel, which is well worth watching, Anil About ME. He's completely bedridden. And he's been like that for a long time. And he makes these extraordinarily powerful videos, which must take him weeks or months to put together. But he does it. This is his way of finding meaning. And it allows him to take back agency and to kind of fight back. And so this is something that, in whatever way you might think is right for you, and given your situation, is to think, what can I do? And not to think that small things don't add up. They do. Every action has an effect. Every action has a ripple effect. And you never know whom you might help by saying something more about ME or about your story. So one important way to find meaning, I think, is to take part in this process. And in this way, we are correcting the injustices of the present ME/CFS patients, of those who will get it in future generations, and even those who got it in the past and who are no longer with us, because their story also matters. So that's the first way of thinking about finding meaning. The second is to find meaning in the process of suffering itself. So now we're going from the big picture down to the more visceral. And this is not easy. It's taken me a long time to get to the point where I'm about to share these kinds of thoughts with you. But the question to think about is, how do you approach the experience of suffering? Now, personally, I've had times where the suffering is so hard that this is not a question I even think about. I'm just trying to get through that time. But there are other times when I have more space around the suffering and I can think about this. And oftentimes, and I'm sure this might be familiar, if I'm not very well and I'm in a crash, thoughts will run through my head like, is this going to go on forever? This is awful. Is this my life, etc., etc. But it is actually possible in those moments to dig within yourself and to find certain qualities that are already within you, but which you just need to generate in those moments. And in doing that, in finding those qualities, you can actually bring meaning to the experience of suffering. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about things like courage. I'm talking about self-love. And I'm talking about patience. So when you're actually suffering, you can feel like your body has betrayed you. You can feel like, I don't want to be in this body. But the fact is, you are a living being who is suffering, and someone else would extend compassion to you. So why not also extend it to yourself. And so to generate something like self-love and actually say, I see that my body is suffering right now. And maybe put your arms around yourself and actually say, I'm actually extending love towards the suffering in my body, even, to say, even towards the symptoms. It's a very different way of approaching it, but it can really soften things in some way. To bring courage to what you're facing. The symptoms can be pretty awful. But if you think about, people you may know who have had other illnesses, who have borne those illnesses with courage, there's something that really speaks to us as humans when we see someone doing that. But you have that quality as well. I mean, everyone here is already very courageous because you've got this far with this illness. But you can choose also in those difficult moments to say, I actually choose to develop and generate courage towards these symptoms. And then there's patience. It's so easy to panic when you have a bad crash. But, at least I can say in every previous case for me, and I think for the vast majority of patients, maybe not always, maybe more severe cases, it may become a bit more complex, or the circumstances might change. But in general, the body does pull you out of a bad crash. And so to develop trust and patience when you're resting, to say to yourself, I'm just going to rest, I'm going to give my body what it needs, and I trust that actually it's going to take me out of this crash. And so to really think about the kind of qualities that you can bring to your experience of suffering, this can really give you meaning because you're taking back agency. You're bringing some control back into the situation. And that's something that can really help. And this can be linked to, you can say, yeah, I'm going to generate self-compassion or love or whatever. But this can also be linked to thinking of role models. And this is a very helpful practice, actually. Think of people, they may or may not have ME/CFS. They may have had a different illness or different kinds of hardships. But think of role models in your life, people you really admire because of how they have managed their particular suffering. And there's something that if you bring these people into your mind, you don't have to overanalyze it. You just immediately can feel, you can intuit what that person brought to their situation. And just by doing that, you can actually take on those qualities. Just say, I want to be like that person. As I say, you don't have to overanalyze, but you can just intuit from thinking about how that person went about what they were facing. I have a very close friend with ME/CFS, and I often think of her example when I'm suffering, and it does help me. And there's another person I think of who many of you may have heard of, is Whitney Defoe. And Whitney Defoe is the son of Professor Ron Davis, Ron Davis, who's at Stanford, who works on ME/CFS. And Ron switched his whole career to researching this illness once his son developed it. And Whitney has been bedridden for over a decade. He has not left his room in that time, except when he's being carried out to go to hospital. He cannot speak. He cannot swallow. He is fed through a tube. And he says that for him, he will fight every day he gets through. ME/CFS is another real victory. And that's how he gets meaning in his life, that he will always choose to keep fighting. And not only does he do that, but he writes some really hard-hitting blogs, which he publishes as podcasts using an artificial voice. And he also has raised, I believe, over $100,000 for fundraising. So this is someone who, when I'm struggling, and my symptoms have a terrible tendency of coming up in the middle of the night and preventing me from sleeping, I will think of Whitney Defoe, and his example gives me courage just by thinking of, just briefly, how he's gone about things. If he fights, so do I. So those are some ways to develop meaning from within the experience of suffering. Now I'm going to talk about reducing meaning from actually reducing suffering. So we all know the example of when you have the flu or you have some other ailment and it's feeling pretty rotten, and you just want it to be over and you can't wait for it to be over because it's going to be so great not to have the flu. And when it finally lifts, you feel much happier. And that experience is meaningful because you're no longer suffering in the way that you were. Now, the same thing can be applied, theoretically, to ME/CFS. If you can improve with this illness, it's very meaningful because you know what the previous suffering was like. And I myself, as someone who was previously more seriously ill, and I've got a long way to go, but my life is a lot better these days, that's very meaningful for me. Now, of course, the question of how to improve, which is not the subject of this talk, and I'm not sure that I'm qualified to give that advice, it's easier said than done. This is not an easy illness to improve with. So I'm not going to be talking so much about that, but I am going to be talking about 4 different attitudes or 4 different kinds of mindset that I found helpful in the effort to try and improve. The first one is, when you have ME/CFS, you really want to be well, and you can have very big dreams for what you'd like to do when you're better. But those dreams can be so far removed from your current situation that it can be very frustrating to think of them, and it's just too far off. And so one of the things that I found helpful is to switch from having big dreams to small dreams. To ask yourself, if you were to improve 10%, 15%, 20%, what would you be able to do that you would love to do, that actually they would be dreams, but things which you can't do now or which you can't do regularly now? And so one thing I'd encourage you to do is to make a list of small dreams that you have, whether it is to be able to meet friends in person, to do an hour or 2 of creative work or some other kind of work that is meaningful to you, to be able to take part in social groups, or to read or garden or go for a small walk in nature, whatever it is, depending on where you're at the moment. That if you were to improve 15%, you'd love to be able to do those things. And that can be very motivating for staying the course, as it were. The second thing I found helpful is to choose strategies for improvement that are not overwhelming and which you feel that you can commit to. Now, a lot of the time when I've had this illness, I have felt like I have had one foot in hope and, frankly, one foot in despair. And when you're in that situation, it's actually quite hard to line up all the strategies that you would like to do, to have the motivation to actually follow through on those things, because more often than not, a few days in, you probably won't keep going. But what I have found is, if I say to myself, I'm going to choose 2 strategies, and they're not going to be overwhelming, I often find that I can stick to those whether I feel like I want to or not. So I kind of take the motivation part more out of it, and I feel like I can actually do them. Now, for me, that might be something like getting my diet right, trying a certain supplement I've long wanted to try, maybe meditating for 20 minutes just once a day. That feels manageable to me, something that I can commit to. And then that can then help you to actually improve, because you're not doing nothing. You are doing something, and some things do actually add up. And so this can really help with changing from a kind of all or nothing thinking. So to choose things that are not overwhelming. Third piece of advice for motivation to improve, to help with trying to improve, is to have some kind of short practice of self-compassion, something that you can do in the day as a routine that can help generate self-compassion. You know, ME/CFS patients often forget just how ill they are. We forget what it's like to be normal. We are so used to how horrendous a crash can feel that we normalize that. But if a friend or family member were to experience for one day what severe post-exertional malaise feels like, they would still be talking about it months later. You know, they would be, gosh, that time, that time I had ME for a day, God, it was terrible. We forget how bad it is. So it's important to actually have compassion for what you're going through. So here's something, and this is a tip that I've got from someone in the IMET group. In the morning, to take 30 seconds in front of the mirror and just to say something very loving towards yourself. For example, my dear body, I know how much you struggled over the last however many number of years, but I'm on your side, I love you, and we're working together towards a better future. And that's it. 15 seconds is done, but you've generated a message of compassion for yourself. You're seeing yourself from the outside by using the mirror. And over time, this can help you to make better decisions, because when you care more about yourself, you want what is better for you in the long term. And the fourth thing to remember when it comes to motivation towards improvement, and this can seem strange to say, but I think it's fair to say in most cases, again, in the most severe, there may be mechanisms where the following statement may not always be true, but it's not been investigated. But in general, it seems that the body is on your side when you have ME/CFS. Now, to say that sounds strange because post-exertional malaise feels horrendous. But day 1 of post-exertional malaise, day 2, really bad. Day 3, starting to feel better. Day 4, better still. Day 5, suddenly a lot better. Now, your particular frequency of how you recover may be different, but the body pulls you out of it. That's extraordinary. The body pulls you out of it. Why? Because it is on your side. It's trying to heal. In the last year, there's been one of the most extraordinary research findings in relation to ME/CFS. They actually did a muscle biopsy of people, of the muscles in post-exertional malaise. So what's actually happening in the muscles when you crash? And what they found was a lot of the muscle, not all, thankfully, but a lot of the muscle, when you're in PEM, it actually dies. So the muscle tissue actually dies. Scientific term is called muscle tissue necrosis. And this is a very objective finding for why exactly PEM is as bad as it feels. But what happens is your body, even with its limited resources, it regenerates that muscle. It does it slowly, but it does it because it is actually fighting to improve. The situation is really hard for the body, but it is working to try and find homeostasis and to get better. And so that can also be something that can be helpful to remember. So we were talking about role models, and I want to speak more personally now about one of my own main role models. And that is my mum. So this is my mum from a picture of her from when I was very young. This would have been taken when I was about 10. And my mum was someone I very much looked up to when I was young, and later in life found particularly inspiring, and who inspires me still now very strongly. She founded a charity that some of you may be aware of in Ireland called the Irish Hospice Foundation, which campaigns for best practice at end-of-life care. That charity is still going strong. There is a hospice in Dublin called St. Francis Hospice in Raheny, which my mum also fundraised for and founded back in the late 1980s or early 90s. And some of you may sometimes see in early June that there are people selling sunflowers on the street. And these people are selling sunflowers for raising funds for hospice care. And this was my mum's idea. She came up with the idea of sunflowers. And she liked the symbolism of sunflowers because of how they are a plant that turns towards the light. Now, my mum became ill with breast cancer in 2009, and she passed away in 2015. She went through a lot of suffering over that time. She far outlived her prognosis, actually. We learned, both of us together. We used to meditate together. We learned about meditation together. And her whole approach was very inspiring to me. There is a photograph that I want to share with you. This is her 6 months before she died. It was taken in the Czech Republic, and it was the last family holiday we went on. And we had been walking, we came across this lovely little glade with a little chapel, and this photograph was taken. And it, you know, as an image, speaks to me enormously because of this extraordinary smile, despite the suffering that she had been through, particularly acute in that year. And also, I take enormous, like I take, if I have, you know, if I put this picture into my mind when I'm not well, it gives me a kind of quiet encouragement to keep going because of her own example. So this ties in with what I was saying about intuiting from role models. And, you know, this picture, I hope, may inspire for you someone who you feel close to, who maybe had a lot of love towards you or does. And there may be an image that you can think of when you're struggling, because something that I think is one of the most powerful things that you can do. For me, this image has everything I need to know. And a couple of years before she died, she published a book called The Pink Ribbon Path, Prayers, Reflections, and Meditations for Women with Breast Cancer. And a few years after she passed away, I worked on a new edition of the book with the same publisher, where I wrote an introduction, and there were people also, there were new reflections from other people as well in the book, and that book was called Following the Pink Ribbon Path. And I just want to briefly share with you two things from this book. One is a short phrase, and the other is the eponymous poem from the book. So I find these both, again, have been very helpful messages from my own journey with chronic illness. So the first phrase that she had this in the book, it's a Latin phrase, and it's in spem contra spem. And what this means literally is in hope against hope. But to put it in a kind of more translatable way, what it means is to stay in hope when things don't actually seem that hopeful. So to stay in hope even when things don't seem that hopeful. And this is the hardest thing that we humans can actually do. It's the hardest thing we can actually do because we respond very strongly to circumstances. And this involves a lot of surrender. But I saw the real strength. My mum was able to do this much of the time. And it made life, quite magical with her over those years, how she was able to do that. And I'm very poor at doing this myself, but it's something that often does come back to me. And we can choose, to live to the best of our abilities in ways that actually give, our life meaning and where we're doing things that are nurturing for us, despite our struggles. And then finally, this is the poem from the book that I will read to you. Title of the poem, The Pink Ribbon Path. And obviously the pink ribbon path refers to breast cancer, but you could say the ME/CFS path, you could say any path involving ill health, any path involving any kind of real hardship in life. I think you could replace the pink ribbon path with that. Okay. So I have found this poem to be very meaningful. I think it talks about how chronic illness can open the heart in important ways. And that can be a surprising blessing because you start to see what's really important. And it also talks about the courage that's necessary when you have these kinds of illnesses. So the pink ribbon path is the path of the heart, where the cry of the heart is heard. I will stay on this path, walk straight in its curves. I will not be afraid. I will not be perturbed. The pink ribbon path is the path of the heart, where the ear of the heart hears you. Okay, thank you.